Imagine this. A 72-year-old man slowly walking into a sacristy on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, holding his hat tightly in both hands, his head lowered so deeply that he cannot even bring himself to look up. He is not walking in with confidence or peace, but with the heavy burden of something he has carried for decades finally pressing down on him. He had lived 48 years in the same marriage. He had raised his children in the faith. He had attended Mass almost every Sunday of his life. For years, he prayed the rosary with his family. From the outside, anyone would have described him as a good man, a faithful believer, someone close to God. His home was filled with images of Our Lady of Guadalupe. He had made pilgrimages to Tepeyac more than once. He participated in parish life, served as an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, and was known by many as a model Catholic. But when he finally lifted his eyes, what I saw was not peace. It was something I have learned to recognize over years of ministry, the crushing weight of a sin never confessed. With a broken voice, fragile like old glass, he said, "Father, I have been carrying something for more than 30 years that I have never told anyone. Not my wife, not my children, not any priest. And now that I feel I am close to death, I am terrified. I am afraid to stand before God with this burden on my soul." At that moment, the man broke down completely. He cried like a small child, and I cried with him, because what he was carrying was not something strange or sensational. It was not something the world would necessarily label as shocking, but spiritually it was serious. A grave sin, hidden deep in silence for 3 decades, never spoken because of shame, never confessed because he believed it was too late, too disgraceful, too heavy for God to forgive. And that is exactly where the oldest deception begins. The lie that whispers to the human heart that your sin is the one exception God cannot forgive. The lie that pushes you into silence, that isolates you in shame, that convinces you to carry the burden alone until it becomes unbearable. In that silence, the soul slowly suffocates, not because God is absent, but because the person refuses the mercy that has been waiting all along. Today, I am speaking directly to you watching this, because this message is not random. There are moments in life that feel ordinary, but are not, and this may be one of them. I want to talk about 5 sexual sins that almost no one confesses, not because they are rare, but because they are extremely common, even among people of faith, even among those who attend church, even among those who believe they are living correctly. These are sins hidden behind silence, shame, habit, or the false belief that God already knows, so there is no need to say anything. But that is one of the most dangerous illusions. Forgiveness is not automatic in silence. It is received through truth. And confession is not optional when serious sin is present. It is the path Christ himself established for the healing of the soul. Before we begin, there is something essential to understand. The Church has never changed its teaching on the seriousness of sexual sin. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, in paragraph 2351, explains that lust is an indisordered desire for or inordinate enjoyment of sexual pleasure when it is sought outside the proper order established by God, outside the unity of marriage and its sacred purpose. This is not personal opinion. It is a consistent teaching of the Church rooted in Scripture and preserved for centuries. And when we speak of grave sin, we are speaking seriously, not symbolically, not lightly. We are speaking about something that, if not reconciled through sincere repentance and sacramental confession, separates the soul from God. I know this language is uncomfortable for many today. In many places, even within churches, words like hell are rarely mentioned anymore, as if silence could erase reality. But Jesus himself spoke about it more than almost any other topic. He spoke of eternal separation, of consequences, of judgment, and of truth that cannot be ignored. And a priest who truly loves his people cannot remain silent where Christ was not silent. The first sin that almost no one confesses, yet one of the most widespread, is pornography. And this is not limited to the young, as many people assume. That is a serious misunderstanding. In reality, Pornography has quietly entered the lives of older men and women as well, people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Those who live alone, those who spend long nights in silence, those who hold a phone in their hands when no one is watching. It is in those moments of isolation that the struggle begins. The enemy does not need complex strategies when loneliness already exists. He only needs silence, exhaustion, and privacy. What often begins as curiosity or a moment of weakness can slowly become a hidden chain that affects the mind, the imagination, and the heart. St. Paul warns clearly in Ephesians 5-3 that even a hint of sexual immorality should not exist among believers, not because the topic is forbidden, but because it damages the interior life and weakens the soul's ability to remain pure before God. And yet, many people have fallen into this and never confessed it. Some because of shame, some because they convinced themselves it was not serious, others because they became used to carrying it in secret. But silence does not erase sin. Silence deepens its power, and this is where the real battle of the soul begins. The danger of pornography is not only in what is seen, but in what it slowly does to the human soul over time. It reshapes desire, weakens discipline, and creates a hidden dependency that many people do not even recognize until they feel trapped. What begins as a moment of weakness can gradually become a pattern, and what becomes a pattern can quietly turn into a spiritual wound that affects prayer, conscience, and even relationships. Many people believe that because it is done in secret, it does not have real consequences, but spiritual life does not work that way. Every action that is freely chosen leaves an imprint on the heart, and when that action contradicts the dignity God has given to the human person, it creates an internal conflict that does not disappear simply because time passes. This is why so many carry this sin for years without speaking it, not because they do not know it is wrong, but because shame grows stronger with silence. The more it is hidden, the more difficult it becomes to bring into the light. And the enemy uses that silence as protection for the sin, convincing the person that confession is too difficult, too embarrassing, or no longer necessary. But nothing becomes less serious just because it is hidden. There is also a misunderstanding that must be corrected. Some believe that temptation itself is sin, that a passing thought, an image that appears unexpectedly, or an internal struggle automatically makes someone guilty before God. That is not true. Temptation is part of human life. Even Christ himself was tempted. The difference lies in how the heart responds. The real danger begins when a person accepts the thought, feeds it, returns to it willingly, and allows it to take root. That is when the will becomes involved, and that is where moral responsibility begins. This distinction is important because many people suffer unnecessary guilt for things they did not freely choose, while at the same time ignoring actions they did freely accept. Another reality that must be acknowledged is how modern life constantly exposes people to sexual imagery. It is present in advertisements, films, social media, and even casual browsing. The world no longer protects the mind in the way it once did. Instead, it often stimulates desire without warning, repeatedly and aggressively. Because of this, the spiritual struggle today is different. It is more constant, more subtle, and more integrated into daily life. This is why vigilance is no longer optional. It is necessary, not in fear, but in awareness. And yet, even in this environment, grace is not weaker. God has not become distant. His help has not decreased. What has changed is the need for discipline, prayer, and sacramental life to be taken seriously again. This is where confession becomes not only a place of forgiveness, but a place of rebuilding, because what is broken in silence cannot be healed in silence. It must be spoken, acknowledged, and surrendered to God. There is another sin closely related to this that also remains hidden for many years: adultery. Not only in its physical form, but also in past relationships that were never properly confessed or fully brought before God. Many people carry events from decades ago that they assume no longer matter because time has passed. But time does not erase moral truth. It only moves it deeper into memory. There are people who once lived double lives, relationships that were never confessed, honestly, decisions made in secrecy that were never fully repented for. And even if those events are in the past, the spiritual weight remains when they are never brought into the light of confession. Some assume that because the people involved are no longer alive, or because life has moved on, there is no need to revisit those sins. But reconciliation with God is not based on memory alone. It is based on truth and repentance. And anything left unspoken before God remains unresolved in the soul. This is why honest confession matters so deeply. Not a partial confession, not a selective one, but a complete surrender of truth before God, no matter how long ago the events occurred. And yet, even here, mercy is greater than guilt. Nothing from the past is beyond the reach of forgiveness when it is finally placed before God with sincerity. But silence keeps people trapped in an illusion that they are already forgiven, while inwardly still carrying what has never been fully surrendered. And that hidden weight often leads into the next struggle, the one that lives not only in actions, but in the mind itself. There is a deeper layer of struggle that many people never recognize as sin, even though it quietly shapes their entire interior life. It is not always visible in actions, and it does not always involve external behavior. Instead, it takes place in the mind, in private thoughts that are allowed to grow without resistance. This is the sin of deliberate, impure thoughts, where the heart does not simply face temptation, but chooses to remain within it. Many people mistakenly believe that thoughts are harmless, that as long as nothing physical happens, there is no moral responsibility. But this understanding is incomplete and leads to serious confusion in the spiritual life. The truth is that temptation itself is not sin. Thoughts can appear suddenly, without invitation, and without consent. These moments are part of human weakness and do not carry moral guilt on their own. Even the holiest individuals experience them. The real moral moment comes after the thought appears, when the will either rejects it or begins to entertain it. When a person deliberately returns to such thoughts, when they choose to remain in them, when they begin to enjoy and prolong them internally, then the heart becomes involved. At that point, what was once temptation becomes an act of consent within the mind, and this is where spiritual danger begins to take root. Many people never bring this to confession because they underestimate its seriousness. Others remain silent because they feel embarrassed or believe that it is not real sin since no external action occurred. But interior life is still moral life. The mind is not separate from the soul. It is part of it. What is chosen internally still shapes the direction of the heart. In today's world, this struggle has become even more intense. The constant presence of sexualized content across media, advertising, and digital platforms means that the mind is repeatedly exposed to images and suggestions that were once avoidable. This creates a continuous interior battle that many people feel but do not fully understand. Some describe it as a mental fatigue, a kind of ongoing struggle where unwanted thoughts appear repeatedly, especially during moments of loneliness, stress, or silence. And over time, without guidance or confession, this can become normalized, even though it continues to wound the interior life. This is why discernment is essential. Not every thought is chosen, and not every temptation is sin. But not every thought should be accepted either. The spiritual life requires learning the difference between what appears and what is embraced, between what passes through the mind and what is allowed to remain. In this context, many people underestimate how much influence repeated internal consent has on the soul. What begins as occasional indulgence in thought can slowly form habits of imagination that are difficult to break. These habits do not remain neutral. They affect prayer, focus, relationships, and even the way a person sees others. And yet, there is always a path back. Confession is not only about forgiveness, it is about clarity. It helps a person name what has been hidden and separate what is temptation from what is sin. It restores order where confusion has grown. Alongside this struggle of thought, there is another reality that remains buried in silence for many people. Past relationships and moral failures that were never fully confessed or properly reconciled with God. Many carry memories from earlier stages of life, decisions made in youth or during periods of weakness that were never brought honestly into the light. They assume that because those moments are in the past, they no longer matter. But the past does not disappear spiritually just because it is no longer active in daily life. There are people who once lived in relationships outside of marriage or who were involved in situations that conflicted with their faith, but who never fully confessed those experiences with complete honesty. Sometimes shame prevented full disclosure. Sometimes they minimized what happened. Sometimes they simply avoided speaking clearly about it. Over time, they convinced themselves that silence meant forgiveness. But forgiveness in the Christian understanding is not silent avoidance. It is reconciliation. And reconciliation requires truth. Even when time has passed, even when circumstances have changed, the need for honest confession remains. Not to reopen old wounds, but to allow healing to reach areas that were never exposed to grace. And here again, mercy is not limited by time. No past is too distant for God to heal. But what remains unspoken remains unhealed, not because God refuses to forgive, but because the person has never fully opened that part of their life to Him. And when these hidden burdens remain, they often connect to a deeper spiritual problem that is even harder to recognize. A false sense of being already reconciled, when in reality something essential was never truly confessed. One of the most dangerous spiritual illusions is the belief that everything is already forgiven simply because time has passed or because a confession was made in the past. Many people sincerely believe they are in a state of peace with God, while in reality, there are areas of their life that were never fully brought into the light. This often happens when a confession was incomplete, when something serious was intentionally left unsaid out of shame, fear, or confusion. At the moment, the person may have felt relief, thinking that saying most of it was enough. But silence about a grave matter is not a small detail. It changes the integrity of the sacrament itself. There are also cases where confession was made in a rushed or superficial way, without true sorrow for sin or a firm intention to change. In such moments, the words may have been spoken, but the interior disposition was missing. And without sincerity, what should be a moment of healing becomes spiritually incomplete. Over time, people forget details, or they convince themselves that what happened does not matter anymore. But conscience does not always remain silent. It often returns in moments of reflection, especially later in life, when the weight of unaddressed matters becomes more noticeable. This is why some people experience a persistent inner unrest even after many years of regular religious practice. It is not necessarily a lack of faith, but sometimes an unresolved area of conscience that was never fully surrendered. The soul remembers what the mind tries to ignore. The Church teaches clearly that for confession to be valid, it must include honest disclosure of serious sin, sincere contrition, and a real intention to avoid sin in the future. When something grave is deliberately withheld, it is not just an omission. It affects the completeness of reconciliation. But this truth is not meant to create fear or despair. It is meant to restore clarity. Because God does not desire confusion in the soul, He desires truth, and truth is what opens the door to healing. Even in cases where past confessions were imperfect, the solution is not guilt or self-punishment. The solution is simply to return to God honestly, to speak clearly, to bring everything into the light without hiding or minimizing anything. What matters now is not how long it has been, but whether the heart is willing to be honest today. This is where mercy becomes real, not abstract. Because mercy is not just an idea of forgiveness. It is an encounter that restores what was broken when truth is finally spoken. And for many people, this becomes a turning point in life. Not because their past changes, but because their relationship with the past changes. What was once hidden becomes surrendered, and what was once heavy begins to lose its power. At this stage, there is also a deeper pastoral concern, the awareness of life's final direction. As people grow older, the reality of death becomes less theoretical and more immediate. It is no longer something distant or abstract, but something that feels closer, more personal, more certain. In that context, unresolved spiritual matters become even more important, not out of fear, but out of preparation. Because the end of life is not the time for uncertainty about the state of one's soul. It is the time for peace, clarity, and reconciliation. This is why the Church offers the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, especially for those who are elderly or facing serious illness. It is a gift of grace meant to strengthen the soul and prepare it for the final journey, but it does not replace confession. It works alongside it. When serious sins remain unconfessed, delaying reconciliation until the final moments of life can become spiritually risky, not because God is unwilling to forgive, but because human clarity and strength may not be available at that time. Weakness, fear, or confusion can make those final moments difficult. That is why reconciliation is meant to happen while there is still time, while the mind is clear and the heart is capable of honest reflection. It is not about urgency driven by panic, but about wisdom in recognizing what truly matters before the final stage of life arrives. And yet, even here, the message remains the same. It is never too late to return. No matter how long something has been hidden, no matter how heavy it feels, God does not close the door to anyone who approaches him with sincerity. Because ultimately, what God desires is not punishment, but restoration. And that leads into the final call for concrete action and return. There comes a point where understanding is no longer enough, and reflection alone is not what brings change. The moment arrives when the soul is invited to move from awareness into action, from inner recognition into a concrete step toward God. Because truth that remains only in the mind does not heal the heart, it must be lived. Many people spend years carrying spiritual burdens without realizing how close the solution actually is. Not in complicated theology, not in distant effort, but in a simple act of honesty before God through the sacrament of reconciliation. The difficulty is rarely in God's willingness to forgive, but in the human struggle to speak the truth completely and without hiding. This is why the invitation is always practical, not abstract, not theoretical, but grounded in something very real. Returning to confession, not once in a long while out of obligation, but as a living part of spiritual renewal, a place where the soul is regularly cleansed, corrected, and strengthened. The Church encourages confession not as a burden, but as a path to freedom. Because what remains hidden continues to weigh down the conscience, even when life appears normal on the outside. And what is brought into the light loses its power to control the heart. Alongside confession, there is also the need for consistent spiritual support. Prayer is not simply a ritual, it is a lifeline for the interior life. Among all forms of prayer, the Rosary holds a special place because it constantly returns the mind and heart to Christ through the presence of Mary. It becomes a rhythm that slowly reorders the interior world of a person. The Eucharist, when received in a state of grace, is another source of strength. It is not symbolic in a superficial sense, but deeply real in its spiritual effect. It strengthens the will, purifies intention, and restores what sin weakens over time. Many people underestimate how much spiritual resilience comes from regular participation in the sacraments. There is also the discipline of small sacrifices, which trains the heart to resist impulses rather than follow them blindly. Simple acts of self-control, offered quietly to God, become a way of breaking patterns that have formed over years. They do not need to be extreme, they need to be consistent. And then there is the importance of removing what feeds temptation, not through fear of the world, but through wisdom about personal weakness. The environment a person allows into their life has a direct influence on their interior struggle. Choosing what to watch, what to listen to, and what to keep close is part of spiritual responsibility. Sacramentals also serve as reminders of faith and protection. Objects like holy water, sacred images, or devotional items are not magical solutions, but physical signs that point the heart back to God. They help maintain awareness of His presence in daily life. But beyond all practices, the most important step remains the same: honesty. Without honesty, nothing else becomes stable. With honesty, even a fragile beginning can become the start of real transformation. There is no need to delay this return, not because fear should guide the decision, but because clarity should. Life is not something we control indefinitely, and the right moment to reconcile with God is always the present, not an uncertain future. For those who feel distant, or who believe they have gone too far, or who think too much time has passed, the invitation remains unchanged. God does not withdraw his mercy from anyone who sincerely seeks him. The door is not closed by time, but only by refusal. And so the final step is simple, not complicated, not overwhelming. Find the opportunity for confession. Speak honestly. Do not minimize. Do not hide. Bring everything into the light and allow God to do what only he can do. Forgive completely and restore the soul. Because in the end, what God offers is not condemnation, but peace, not shame, but freedom, not distance, but return. And that return is always open to anyone willing to take the step. And for those who do, the words of Christ remain the same across every generation. Forgiveness is real, mercy is real, and peace is possible.